Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa. With us today is Dr. J.K. Srinivasan. He's a research scientist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, also the co-author of the book Beyond the Lean Revolution, Achieving Successful and Sustainable Enterprise Transformation. It's a compilation of 7 principles leaders can use to transform their organizations. His research centers on the application of principles used in lean enterprises to public sector services and groups. He joins us today to talk about what he is doing, share his recommendations for transforming organizations into innovative teams. JK, welcome to Rappler. Thank you for joining us.
This is awesome to be here, Maria. Thank you.
Well, let me jump in with how do you build change into an organization?
It's hard. It's hard because everybody talks about transforming, everybody talks about change, but by and large, when it boils down to the fact that it's you who has to change, it's incredibly hard, right? And it boils down to two ideas. One is structural inertia, the fact that the firms are successful because of what they do, and they've been doing it for so long that the processes come into play. So the core competence essentially becomes the core rigidity, right?
Right.
That's what C.K. Perlat said, and you know, for 20 years later, it's still true. Now, the other side of it is cultural. It's the human side. In the end, most successful organizations are about their people. And the people that lead these organizations were successful by doing what got the organization to where it is in the first place.
Yes.
So that cultural inertia of this is how we've always done it, this is the rules and the norms embedded in the cultural values of the organization drive the behavior. So when you have those two aspects, it's really hard to get an organization to recognize it has a problem, right? How do you get an organization to see itself?
You've done a lot of different work with different organizations. I mean, large organizations, the U.S. Army, different other groups. How do you help them?
One is being a neutral agent. I mean, the majority of times what ends up happening is, and I'm probably going to get a lot of heat for this, large organizations tend to outsource their leadership decisions. What I mean by that is they'll hire a consultant so that the consultant can make a recommendation so the leader doesn't have to make that hard choice.
Political will is part of
Political
it, right?
will.
Yeah.
And it's also that organizations have gotten so busy that they don't know to stop and look at themselves. And leaders don't know the work that's actually being done.
Yes.
So there are so many layers between what is the ground reality versus what the senior leader is being briefed, that they have talking points that they're talking about without ever knowing what the work looks like. I mean, look around in Rappler itself, right? Everybody sitting in a flat environment talking to each other, you know the work. And I think that's the hard part, is when leaders don't know what the work that's happening within their organizations, it becomes abstract. That separation of work from the decisions that drive the work is when you get into a disconnect, right? And I think that's the hard part. What we have done with our research is basically combined what the School of Engineering at MIT calls the systems thinking approach with what the School of Management calls the action learning approach.
Okay.
And Andrew Van der Ven has a wonderful term for it. He calls it engaged scholarship.
Okay.
It is how do we bridge the theory practice gap? And a lot of times, the stuff that I'm talking about is not rocket science.
Yes.
Although I'm an aerospace engineer by training, we won't go there, right? It's not rocket science. It is about applying common sense. How hard is it for leaders to actually ask their own organizations, what are we doing that's on the stupid list? How many leaders ask that question, and how many people are willing to honestly answer that question?
Right.
But when you have a neutral broker that doesn't have a financial skin in the game, come study the organization for what it is, it becomes really easy to have that conversation with that senior leader. And at the same time, in a lot of our organizational studies, whether we're talking about the Army or we're talking about small startups, the people doing the work have never been asked what they think. Right? In this day and age, when information is so cheap, that is criminal. That basically sets the organization up in a lot of ways for failure, because the people that knowledge workers vote with their feet. You're a standing example of that, right?
Yes.
You left probably one of the best, largest, well-known organizations to come form your own firm because you thought it was the right thing to do. That's what every knowledge worker does. They vote with their feet. And the ones that stay, are they really the best, or are they staying for circumstance?
So why is it so crucial now? Why are all these companies, and this is part of the reason you came to the Philippines, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Why are all the companies scrambling now to figure out how to deal with change and the other magic word they're all looking for, innovation?
It becomes, social media is a great example. Like information flows a lot faster and a lot freer, right? I did my doctoral work in Sweden. In a lot of ways, it's the truest form of industrial democracy we have, right? You can be sitting in a room having a conversation with somebody across the lunchroom table and then find out later on that was the CEO. There's no pretension about you have a role, you have a function, but there's a certain humility that comes to, and belonging that comes to being part of a firm, where you have a shared identity, right? You don't feel that. And what was interesting, I was talking to a couple of young entrepreneurs here, right? There is a sense of who they are and value me for me, the person, right? It's not about your degree. It's not about your pedigree. It's about how well you can do the work. It essentially comes down to appreciate me for what I am and respect me as a person first, and then as how I affect your bottom line.
Interesting.
Right? And when you reframe it, and essentially a lot of, so in India 10 years ago, 15 years ago, my generation that graduated school wanted a 9-to-5 job.
Yes.
Innovation, entrepreneurship was not, it wasn't part of the equation at all, because we didn't have a social safety net.
Yes.
Right? You didn't have things like couch surfing. You had to go home and live with mom and dad, and guess what? You didn't want to be that failure. So there was social pressure to not fail. You didn't have a safety net to fail.
Yes.
This current generation, in India, you go now, they don't want to work for big companies. They want to build their own firms. They want to dictate their own hours. One of my doctoral students is doing incredible work looking at startups in Armenia, right? Same pattern of behavior, right? They're at this point now where they're trying to inject innovation and get young engineers to think about building products as opposed to having a career as opposed to having a job.
Interesting. What's your impression of the Philippines?
And I guess I'm spoiled, right? So I came to Cebu for Oceans 14, and
Oceans 14 is the Young Global Leaders extension of the World Economic Forum.
And the timing of it was perfect. School just finished, so I could come on. And what I heard, the energy of what I heard was, what can we do? Not, here's why we can't do it. The conversation around was around, what can we do?
Yeah.
Here's how we make progress. Rarely have I seen every talk that highlighted a success end with loud applause and cheers. So when we left Cebu Sunday evening, it was like a letdown. Like, you had this energy high. It was the way you finished it, right? You said, listen, now we've got momentum. How do you sustain it? How do you not lose that when you go? But that was the feeling that I got. And then over the last 2-3 days, and tomorrow, we're meeting with the 100 CEOs, the top 100 CEOs of the Philippine companies. And again, you hear the same thing. There is, you stand at that frontier where you can leapfrog everybody else, which is what is really exciting.
Yes.
Right? The idea here of, it's the work itself, but how you change the work, how you do digital innovation, right?
Correct.
You can leverage technology now fundamentally to change and leapfrog other countries.
Yes.
Not just within sectors, but nationally. One of the things that I heard quoted a lot at Cebu, was how much the competitiveness indicators have gone up in the Philippines on the WEF Global Competitiveness Index.
Yes.
And you think about that, and you think about the fact that the average age in this country is 26?
23.
23.
The median age is 23, so the average age is, yes, go ahead.
So you're really talking about digital natives.
Yes, absolutely.
Everybody here uses a smartphone. You've got a lot of data
Yeah.
about, and their notions of privacy are very different.
You're
trading.
It doesn't exist.
Well, no, but they're willing to trade personal privacy for convenience, right?
Correct.
That's exploitable. That means you can create new products and services faster than everybody else.
even in forming Rappler, I mean,
Yeah.
we had choices of different countries around the world, and we chose the Philippines, not just because we come from here, but for me, this is a social media petri dish. And it is a 20-something demographic that embraces it.
So Rappler is a great example, right? When you think about, so I'm going to highlight the fact I'm an academic. Schumpeter highlights 5 sources of innovation in firms,
Okay.
right?
This is Joseph Schumpeter.
Yes.
Okay.
So 1934, going back a ways,
That
right?
far ago. Okay.
Right? So we're talking about new ways, new products,
Yes.
new ways of making products,
Okay.
new supply chains, new markets, and new ways of organizing. Thought to be sort of mutually exclusive, right? You do one of these 5 things. What you do with technology is you blur those boundaries really easily,
Correct.
and you're addressing multiple things. We were talking about this off camera, right? I see Rappler as doing a lot of different things, right? One, you're fundamentally connecting the idea of you're not going to do passive journalism anymore. Right? You're going to take interested people and make them active communities, and you're going to use technology as the medium that does that. And you're tapping into that fundamental sense of who the Filipino people are: fun, young, hip, connected, and want to make a difference because they saw their parents grow up under an environment of no trust in government. And there's nobody else that can do that. That is the power of what we're talking about here. That's what makes studying Filipino firms so interesting, and that's what makes studying ASEAN even more interesting.
Yes.
To me, the reason I got involved was Winston came and took one of my classes at MIT.
This is Winston D'Amarelio,
Yeah,
one
one
of
of
the
the
young
organizers
global
of
leaders.
Ocean,
Yeah.
And it was such an exciting conversation. So the frameworks, my mental model for change was 5 years, right?
Yes.
And then Winston was doing a case study here, taking some of what he had learned, came back and he told me, hey, we're going to start this thing. I'm like, Roger, got it. Best of luck. Talk to me in 6 months. So I talked to him in 6 months and he goes, yeah, here's where we are. And I'm like, wait a minute, how did you guys do it so fast? How did you take what would be a incredibly hard, laborious process of getting senior leaders engaged, getting people across the organization to understand what you're trying to do, communicating that vision? He was like, they got smart. They went really high, then went really low, and then came back. So the way they're able to iterate through change is way faster. And you can do it when you're using technology and you're using technology right.
Yes.
But it's not a panacea, right? So again, here's the hard part with technology. Technology for the sake of technology over a bad process just makes it a very fast bad process.
Yes.
So that's what's going to be interesting, is how do we build those capabilities over time within firms such that they can see it, they can build it, and they can evolve with it.
So if you're talking to the top CEOs,
Yeah.
the CEOs of the top 100 companies, what advice are you going to give them?
It boils down. I mean, so when Debbie Nightingale and I talk about the 7 principles of transformation, we really talk about taking a holistic approach. How do you get firms to stop thinking about what's within their span of control?
Okay.
Right.
That's really hard if you're successful because you want to control everything.
We're going back to the cultural inertia problem.
Correct.
Right? But there are tools. I mean, there are lots of systems thinking tools that allow people to go, what should the boundary be? And once you can get the problem definition right, execution is a lot easier. And really, you have to start thinking about organizations in terms of networks of value exchange. Right? And when you take a network perspective, when you think about people satisficing, am I giving you enough for you to stay engaged? I can't maximize it, but do I know who I'm not keeping happy? Right? That stakeholder perspective combined with taking a holistic approach gives you a foundation on which you can drive change. And of course, you have to get your leaders engaged. Because anytime we're talking about change or transformation, we're talking about investment and commitment.
Incredible. Well, I'm going to just toss some. You talked about 7,
Yes.
right? Can you just quickly go over?
Oh,
what
we're
the
talking
7
about focusing on so taking a holistic approach,
Yep.
knowing your stakeholders and understanding the value proposition,
Okay.
engaging leaders,
Engaging leaders.
focusing on effectiveness before efficiency. Do the right thing first before you're trying to do it right.
Before you try to get the results that you want. Yeah.
Right. We want to make sure that you can understand stability and flow. You need to be able to look at your organization and see what's going on.
Okay.
Right. You need to understand both internal interdependencies and external interdependencies. That goes back to the boundary problem. Right. Once you draw the boundary, again, the span of control behavior basically focuses you inward.
Yes.
But in a lot of times, the source of the problem is probably outside. So how do you understand both in and out?
Yes.
Last but not least, can you learn?
Can you learn? That's interesting. And then the hard part, though, again, when we look at small organizations or governments, once you have control, it's very hard to relinquish control. What advice do you give to?
So now we get into a slightly philosophical question of what control really means, right? That's the beauty of government, right? There's an illusion of control.
Yes.
But in reality, with governmental organizations, the perception is, I'll wait the leadership out.
Yes.
So you have to create a case for change that is compelling enough that people will buy into it. We were having a conversation today with one of the largest Filipino conglomerates, and the conversation was, we have consultants come in all the time, trying to tell us what to do, but we don't know where to go. And we were sitting in a room with about maybe 15 people,
Yeah.
and my response was, "Are you sure you really don't know what to do?" And they're like, "Oh no, we actually sent somebody down to actually talk to everybody." So what did they say? Well, they came back with a list of areas that we need to focus on. Oh, great. Now that you know so you've basically done that sense making to know what the areas that your people think are important.
Yes.
Have you then have you enacted on any of that information? Pin drop silence. Right? So then again, that goes back to that idea that our leaders outsourcing the
Yes.
decision making.
Yes.
You can't. That's a firm that starts doing that runs the risk of becoming obsolete.
So what's that change? Is it just the decision makers are afraid to do it, don't want to do it?
Or feel they don't have enough information. So again, in an information-rich world,
Yes.
you have leaders feeling they're information poor.
Yes, yes. But if you go, Ben Horowitz wrote
Yeah.
this book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. I mean, he says that the CEO's job is always to make decisions without enough information.
So you can operate under incomplete information.
Yes.
But what happens when you're operating in an information void?
Okay.
That goes back to that, at Cebu I was talking about how things happen, right?
Yes.
As information
How stuff happens. I remember the slide. Yes.
Yeah. As information flows down, everybody's agency gets in, right? And the more layers you have, the more shaping it happens. And by the time, so something that is bad translates or is reframed as being good because it represents somebody else's agency. And when you have a CEO that doesn't walk and see the work, again, it goes back to, do you know the work? Do you know why you do what you do?
Yeah.
Right? If it boils the question of who you're trying to create value for, how you're creating that value, how do you know you're creating that value? Being able to those simple questions of the what value, who you're creating value for, and how you know. When you're able to answer those three simple questions, and everybody across the organization saying the same thing, I mean, okay, so congruence is bad. You need
Yes.
requisite variety.
Yes.
But fundamentally, you need to be able to say, hey, this is how we make money is X. There are other sources of disruptive innovation out there that I probably need to deal with. And they are orthogonal sometimes.
There are lots of questions coming in right now.
Okay.
So let's continue this. So we're just talking about change within the organization, and you talked about the seven
Yep.
elements that lead to that. What about, forget beyond change, how do you build innovation into your company?
Learning to see yourself. Again, that goes back to the work. In a lot of ways, people within organizations know what the next frontier is. Are you listening?
Yes.
And are you creating pathways? Rockwell Collins is a great example of that, right?
Yes.
An avionics firm that's successful where a lot of other avionics firms are not successful. Rockwell does it in really smart ways. They know that there's long-term technology they need to deal with,
Yeah.
right? There's medium-term technology, there's immediate technology. And guess what? The innovation's happening in fields that have nothing to do with aerospace defense, avionics, or aerospace systems. So how do I look outside? And that's where open innovation comes in. Right? How do the way they've changed their culture is rewarding people for doing open innovation. So when you're a firm that prides itself fundamentally on being an engineering culture,
Yeah.
the way they've done open innovation, incentivized it, is say, hey, part of doing your job is knowing what everybody else is doing and sharing that information. Mode shift.
Yeah.
Right? There's a mental model shift that says it's not about everything, it's about me building everything.
Yeah.
So I can source value differently. and you can get smart about it.
The models of companies. So this is one company. Other companies that
They all do the same thing, right? So they basically recognize that it's hard to be ambidextrous, right?
Yes.
Trustman and Riley talk about the fact that, again, going back 20 years,
Yes.
talk about a theory-practice gap. They talk about it's hard. So what makes firms successful is the fact that they're able to exploit what they already know really, really well.
Right.
And at the same time, in parallelly asking them to explore, they require different mindsets.
Yes.
So you, in essence, you're going to have to create a parallel culture that allows the firm to do the exploration it needs to do and then come back and exploit it once it finds new sources. You have the same problem with software teams,
Yes.
right? When you have software teams that work on large, stable projects, they use the waterfall
Yes.
over long life cycles. Everybody knows their work. Nobody's thinking about refactoring. Nobody's thinking about change. They're just executing.
Yeah.
And then you have this agile team that's doing sandbox development. That's just throwing stuff together,
Yeah.
demonstrating that it works. How do you take people there and bring them into a structured environment? How do you take people from a structured environment and throw them out there?
Is there a formula?
Smart people. So
Yeah, I hired smart people. No,
well,
sorry.
but again, let's take the Rappler example, right? The four of you that are over 40, the way you put it, elegantly, we'll leave it at that.
Glenda Gloria. No, sorry.
The four of you know how the news business works. Right? You knew you didn't want to do passive journalism anymore. You knew how to make it successful. And you knew what the DNA looked like. You knew the DNA you wanted to imprint on Rappler. And then you hired a lot of people that you could shape. But you didn't just give them the cookie cutter. Right? You gave them the cookie cutter and then made sure that they understood what the underlying tacit knowledge was behind the cookie cutter. And that's built into the Rappler DNA.
But if you're running a large organization of thousands of people, how do you do that midstream?
That's why skunkworks exist. Every organization has its own skunkworks
Yes.
of some sort,
Okay.
right? And then now you're starting to see firms start doing the open innovation contests,
Yes.
right? They
Yes.
start either the crowdsourcing of ideas,
Yes.
leveraging their internal markets.
Yes.
That's why they're doing it.
Yes. So let me throw some questions for you now from social media. JJ Diaz at JDiazMTM is asking, what innovation framework works for flat structure and cross-functional companies?
So it depends on whether we're talking about matrix organizations. So a lot of Swedish organizations have adopted a matrix structure, and it's really, really hard.
Explain a matrix structure.
So there's a question of
Maybe
having
different.
functionals
Yes.
and then having people work across in projects, right? And it basically looks like a matrix. That's why it's
Yeah,
called a matrix.
yeah.
The hard part with that is if you don't have the underlying infrastructure laid out properly, how you're allocating resources, how you're managing those resources. So we did a 3-year study looking at how Swedish firms move work
Yes.
to India and China. One of the things that comes out of that was the simple fact that you have a matrix organization in Sweden, you have hierarchical organizations in India and China, and the matrix manages assets differently than the hierarchy, right? And the matrix thinks about innovation in terms of building a new product, not necessarily sustaining a product. Where the source value is different, right? So the hard part with matrix organizations, flat organizations, is really ensuring that you have the infrastructure to support the change.
Correct.
Not necessarily idea generation.
Yes, agree. So it's basically like most large companies will have made themselves efficient by having a workflow that they stick to. And then innovation comes out of actually breaking the workflow so
Yes.
that you can create something new. And you're going to have to actually that matrix organization is one of our challenges, for your flat structure.
Yeah.
And allocation of resources.
Correct. And knowing how to. So when you talk about knowledge transfer, right, from in outsourcing or offshoring, that's where it becomes a problem. Because the matrix, the resource management component of the matrix, looks at it and says the work is moving away, so I can move assets away. But then they've forgotten about the fact that you actually need to do the knowledge transfer.
Yes.
From-
Before, yeah.
Whatever you're talking about, whichever country you're talking about, to the team that's receiving the knowledge.
Yep.
And that's never built into the budget. And then again, it's an incredible story of learning and forgetting.
What about looking at top-down organizations, Asia? India's not quite like this, but we have high power distance index
India is like
society.
that still.
It is, okay. So
It's changing.
So when members of your organization are afraid or are taught not to challenge authority, The power distance index is high. How do you build innovation into organizations like that?
There's a cultural inculcation that goes on. So when you look at agile teams, a lot of times what ends up happening with firms that have seemed to have broken that power distance problem, it comes down to what they put into their DNA. Is teaching people to question. It was fascinating. So we were having a conversation about an outsourcing project to the Philippines here, where we had the same power distance problem.
Yeah.
And you had the American project managers saying all the right things and trying to do all the right things, right?
Yeah.
Please tell me if there's problems. Please let me know if there's trouble.
Oh, I went through this,
Right?
but they won't tell you.
And they didn't tell.
Yeah.
Until it failed spectacularly.
Correct.
And here you have this project manager who firmly believed that the capabilities existed, that assessed the capabilities.
Yes.
Yet that cultural problem existed. You
Yes.
had the same problem when we were looking at the offshoring study, when they were moving work from Sweden to China.
Okay.
And what ended up happening was they started doing human capital rotations. They had leaders from Sweden come and talk about why we're doing this project. You're not just doing grunt work.
Yes.
We are trying to build capabilities that will allow us to innovate over time, right? And that, again, that goes back to that holistic approach. Do you understand where you're trying to take the organization? Because if you don't do that, then there is the feeling that I'm a grunt, right? And guess what? Your purpose in life is not to be a grunt.
Absolutely, no one wants to.
Right?
Be.
You need to have meaning in work, and that's
And this generation wants that even more than I think I'm older than you, so my generation.
It's the career versus the job perspective.
Right.
Again, I think that's one of the advantages in the Philippines. So when I was talking to the entrepreneur, one of the points he was making was in the BPO, a lot of the younger generation people working in BPO are the creative class.
Yes.
Who are using it as a source of income in order to feed their creative efforts.
To do what they want. Yes. Yeah.
Which allows them to then be a hotbed.
Yes. I'm going to go to that because there's some questions
Go ahead.
about that. But in terms of standard or Asian organizations, which are still led, the CEOs are 50s or 60s. They're traditionally men who are used to wielding power, high power distance index. Do you see innovation coming out of Asia with companies like this?
Can be. It has to do with who's willing to go tell the CEO. So everybody's talking.
The kid that tells the emperor he has no clothes.
Right.
Okay.
And how do you get them to say, okay, the case in point, Winston was making a very powerful point earlier today, said the market today is the digital natives.
Yeah.
If you as a large firm don't recognize that those are the people you're trying to employ, number one. Number two, they're the ones who have the maximum buying power.
Correct.
Yeah, even though in the Philippines you're like India in a lot of ways, right? You have this huge gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Yes.
Even the have-nots, because they're digital natives, have purchasing power in this economy. So if you don't provide, and we joke and we talk about how India and the Philippines are a sachet economy, right? Everything is in sachet. Well, guess what? Their sachet is the digital sachet.
Correct.
What are you doing to take care of that? And then you can't just say throw big data at it or do social media. You need to know why you're doing it. There has to be. We make assumptions about rational decision making in firms when what we find out is a lot of it is done by sense making and good enough decision making.
Correct.
Which is not a bad thing necessarily, as long as it's based on an understanding of the truth, right? What are we trying to do and why?
Yep. I've also worked in large companies where the organizational bias is so strong, it's very hard to even surface the right.
Why are we doing it? CEO said, get on Twitter. Okay, we got on Twitter. Right.
Get Facebook likes.
Well, what does that mean?
Right, exactly.
Does
What's
that
the
translate into any useful?
So what impression did you get of the Filipino leaders you spoke with?
Educated. Or willing to get educated. Let me put it that way. There are some of them that had no idea what the technology is or will look like, but they also recognize that they can source that knowledge in smart ways. Right?
So it's really technology driven. I mean, that is the reason why. Okay.
Here it is. I don't think that's always the case everywhere.
Okay.
But again, every firm is digital now.
Yes.
I mean, I don't think there's a single sector that is. I mean, we used to think hospitality was not digital, and then Airbnb happened, and
Yes.
HomeAway happened, right?
And that's the last thing I want to bring up is that the supply chain, the production chain has changed, right?
Yeah.
It used to be linear where your producer sells to the consumer, but now what if the consumer, in Airbnb's case, the consumer is now also a producer?
Correct.
How do you deal with this kind of world?
We don't know. That's one of the most powerful things that I think I've learned to say is, I don't know, please teach me. And there's a certain amount of, we don't know what this looks like. Right? I mean, a lot of what Airbnb, is it even legal?
Yeah. Yes.
Right?
The rules are
The
still
fact
being
that I have somebody staying in my house and I'm charging them rent, but I'm not paying taxes, is that tax evasion?
correct.
Right? How does it affect the hospitality? And how does it affect the community that I live in?
Right.
It's the exact same problem we're seeing with Uber, right? Uber and
Correct.
Lyft, same
Yeah,
conversation.
Yep.
You're
It
not
was
a limousine, you're not a taxi, you're something in between. They found a gap, they found a need, they met that need with a technology-based solution.
Exploited it. Yes.
They exploited it well, but that's all they saw. Now there's this whole larger can of worms they opened up because we thought it was such a stable industry, we didn't think about it.
Yes.
So a lot of what we're talking about now, I don't think we scenario planned.
And
I
there
mean-
will be new laws there, right? So these businesses will also have to deal with that. Let me ask you one last question from Twitter, and then I can keep asking you questions all day, but they're telling me my time is near up. This is from Twitter, Justin on Twitter. What do you think is the Philippines' deficiency towards innovation?
Over-reliance on technology.
Over-reliance on technology.
I mean,
That's interesting.
so it's the same thing, right?
Yes.
You know it works, and that's the competitive advantage.
Yes.
So are we over-reliant on that, and as opposed to going and not focusing on conventional product development? Now, there is always counterexamples. The minute I say that, you're going to have great designers, Filipino designers, Carbon Puffer is an example, right? Who gave what I thought was one of the best talks.
Yep.
An incredibly insightful look at the design process.
He was incredible. Kenneth Copenport
yeah.
was incredible. Yeah.
And then we're talking about conventional manufacturing with no digital.
Yes.
So pockets exist, right?
Yes.
But the majority of the conversation is on digital now,
Yes.
which is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
But it could, again, core competency may become a core rigidity. We don't know. So that would be the only risk I can think of.
Last words of advice.
You have to care. To me, you can't help an organization change if you don't care. Yeah. And in cases of large transformation efforts, you have to think big, act small, and act fast. Because demonstrating success breeds success. Change is vital when it's successful, right?
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you
you
so
for having
much.
me.
We've been talking to Dr. J.K. Srinivasan. He's a research scientist at the Massachusetts Institute at MIT, not just about his research on transforming organizations, but about his impressions of the Philippines. I'm Maria Ressa. Thank you for joining us. I can talk to you all day.